Hi, Kathryn. Thank you
Hi.
for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've talked about our introduction to human trafficking and what it is, how parents should be involved and what warning signs and everything. And now it's kind of time to talk about the now what part. When survivors have been rescued, taken from the life, everything like that, and you have something to do with that, yes? So can you introduce yourself a little bit to us, and who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so like I said, my name is Kathryn Rogers. I serve as the Executive Director of Strategy and Impact for a nonprofit here in Houston called A Second Cup. I think we'll talk a little bit more about what A Second Cup does later. But our goal is to educate the community about human trafficking, partner with other organizations, and support survivors. And I actually am a licensed social worker. I've been working in Houston in different capacities in child welfare and community development for about the last 10 years. Prior to coming to A Second Cup, I worked with the Department of Family and Protective Services, working with youth who had experienced sexual violence and human trafficking. And I came to join the team at A Second Cup in 2020 and have been there ever since.
Great. Yeah, and I personally I love that. I love Second Cup. We'll definitely talk more about it. But let's jump into something that's really important here about economic empowerment and how that impacts the survivors when they left the life. What is that? How does that play a part in their recovery?
Yeah. First of all, I'm so glad that we get to talk about this. I think that this is a piece of the trafficking narrative and the puzzle that our community is really starting to push into with a lot of enthusiasm. And it's really important to start by recognizing that trafficking exploits people through their work, through their labor, whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking. It's essentially the workplace where people are experiencing trauma and violence. And we know from some studies released in the last couple of years that over 51% of cases, people cited economic need as a primary motivation for why they became vulnerable to trafficking to begin with. So when we talk about the word economic empowerment, the way that we choose to define it can mean a variety of things across a spectrum of services, but the goal is, or the definition we like to use, is the ability for a survivor to independently meet their own needs now and in the future. And so for many, this could look like some support services, whether that be obtaining a GED or some skills training in an industry that they're interested in working. It could mean some support writing a resume, crafting a cover letter, or learning a new trade. For others, it could also mean holistic wraparound support. Survivors of trafficking have experienced a lot of trauma, and those trauma triggers don't go away just because they've left the life. And so sometimes going into the workplace can be a very triggering experience for some people. And so for a lot of our organizations, we offer wraparound support and care so that they know how to cope within the workplace.
And so when the survivors are working on their empowerment and building themselves up afterwards, what are some of the barriers and some of the benefits that they come across from your experience?
Yeah, so there's some interesting statistics that I would share on that. One of those is from an organization called the Freedom Business Alliance that works with businesses that have employed survivors of trafficking. And a statistic that they revealed was that on average, survivors who do not have stable employment revealed that on average, 80% of survivors will return to the life without stable employment. And this is for a number of reasons. One of those being that for a lot of folks, they enter trafficking at a pretty young age. Youth are more vulnerable than most other populations. And so there's some Anytime we talk about data, I personally always like to give a caveat that data is very hard to collect in terms of trafficking because it's still there's still a lot of research being done. But some figures that we've heard are that the average age of entry is anywhere from 14 to 16 years old, especially for sex trafficking. And so that's a really crucial part of someone's development and life. Like if we think about what we were doing at 14 to 16, for most of us, we were looking forward to the future, whether that was college or our careers. And for many, that period is interrupted. So most survivors often have lower levels of education. They often don't have GEDs or diplomas. And for a lot of them, they lack formal or legal workplace experience, and that can be really hard to overcome. Also, unfortunately, because of the way that historically survivors have been treated in our communities, they often come with criminal histories that are also a barrier to employment. Not to mention a lot of the other kind of more common impacts of not having stable housing, identification. For some, it could be documentation status or child care.
And so let's move on to this term recidivism that you and I have discussed outside of this conversation. How would you define that?
Yeah, so we hear the term recidivism a lot. It's used in the criminal justice space, but it's essentially someone who's returning to the life. And like I mentioned, the hold that space, there's a term called trauma bonding, and this happens when an individual is manipulated into believing that they're there because they want to be, or they're there because the person who's violating or exploiting them cares about them. And so it's not uncommon for someone to return to the life. There are a number of different types of pimps, and one of those types of pimps is the Romeo pimp, who behaves as a romantic partner and leads individuals to believe that they are loved and cared about. And so just like very similar to domestic violence, it can take on average 7 to 10 times for someone to truly and permanently leave the life. And this is not to suggest that trafficking is a choice. I want to be very clear in that, in this narrative, that trafficking is exploitation of human beings, but it happens because they're desperate and others are greedy, and it's the intersection of those two things.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that we have touched on this podcast in previous episodes. Two of those things that you've mentioned before. Yeah. So, how can survivors overcome recidivism? What's something that you in your field know that are methods to be successful to overcome it?
We believe that safe and stable employment is one of the strongest protective factors for an individual to prevent returning to the life, as well as to prevent trafficking from even happening. I have a very good friend whose name is Kathryn Givens. She's an overcomer leader, and she's the executive director of 1211 Partners. And she partners with and comes alongside survivors and overcomers of trafficking, and provides mentorship and economic empowerment. And something that I've heard her say several times is that people will not return to trafficking if they feel safe and they feel stable. And we believe that jobs and housing are the two biggest things that survivors need. And so when survivors have the support, the skills, the training, the capacity to move into a job that is going to pay them well, and where they have mobility and space to move up, they are much more likely to remain out of the cycle of violence. And that means that their children are moved out of the cycle of violence. So at A Second Cup, we're really passionate about creating pathways and modeling what economic empowerment looks like in Houston.
Well, since you've mentioned Second Cup, let's talk more about it. So for people who aren't familiar, what is a Second Cup?
So we're a nonprofit coffee shop, and that means that we operate as a business. Our model is called a social enterprise, and we generate funds through sales of coffee, merchandise, made-to-order food, and 100% of those profits or revenues are 100% of those profits or revenues are invested back into the mission to end human trafficking. So we use our space to host educational events. Over the years, we've done things like documentary screenings, panel discussions made up of survivors and overcomers. We've done voting and advocacy for legislation that impacts the field. And then we also use our space to collaborate. We believe really strongly that this work can't be done alone. And so we try to use as many of the resources we have to elevate the work of other organizations, many of whom you have already interviewed on this podcast. And the last thing we do is something we've been doing since 2018, which is investing in aftercare for survivors. So in 2018, we launched a program called Brazen Table, which is a culinary and job skills training program for survivors of trafficking and people who have barriers to employment.
Awesome. And who runs a Second Cup? Whose idea was this?
So the idea came from our founder. Her name is Erica Raggett, and she was a middle school teacher in 2010, and she heard about trafficking. She learned about trafficking from Love 146, which is an incredible national organization that does a lot of amazing work, and she was absolutely, as many of us are, she was absolutely struck by the horror of it and the fact that she could see the reality of that in her classroom. She worked with students who and their families who were in under-resourced communities, which we know are particularly vulnerable to trafficking. And so she said, I have to do something about this. So the idea stemmed from that, a passion to do something and to engage. And she also really loved coffee and wanted to make a space that felt welcoming and open, and it was a place where people could come and learn. It can sometimes be hard to learn about big issues, especially things like trafficking, and so that was her vision. So today, we are run through a co-leadership model. So I serve as Executive Director of Strategy and Impact, and I oversee everything related to our programming, whether that be through supporting survivors, supporting our partner organizations, and our awareness efforts. And then I also oversee our development and fundraising and special events. And my partner, Chastity Mosley, she oversees everything related to finance and operations and making sure that we run very smoothly and effectively.
It seems like you do. You run the place really smoothly.
We hope so.
I love it. No, I love the Second
Yeah.
Cup. I love every time that I walk in there. And it's located in the Heights in Houston,
Yes.
off of 11th Street. Is that right?
Yep,
And
11th and Studemont.
Studemont, yes. Now, if someone wants to, one of our listeners or watchers wants to participate, help, or make any kind of financial donation, anything like that, what are some of the programs that you offer at a Second Cup that they can participate in?
Yes. One of the quickest and easiest ways someone can get involved is by visiting our coffee shop. We make what I consider to be pretty great coffee. So you can come in, grab a cup of coffee. All of those revenues, like I said, are invested back into our work. And that's where you can learn about trafficking. We use our space. We have awareness material in there. And so you can use that to determine what you want your next step to be. We really feel like awareness needs action to follow. So you can come in and find out what you can do. You can also check out our website. We have a lot of great information on www.asecondcup.com. We share information about our allies, our programs, and that's where someone could donate if they felt led to give financially. We're very unique as a nonprofit in that we do have internal revenue that we generate, but we do so much more than a typical coffee shop does. So that means we do rely on community support like donations, but we can leverage those really well. So for every dollar that's donated, we generate $2 through sales, which means that you have a triple impact when you give to a Second Cup. And I would say the last thing that we always ask people to do is to consume consciously and to have conscious behaviors. And so this could be a couple of different things. This could mean in terms of our purchasing. We talk about, I know this is focused on sex trafficking, but we do talk about labor trafficking a lot, and how our consumption choices impact supply chains and demand. And if we are conscious in our choices in the community by voting for people that we know will support the communities who are most vulnerable, by educating others, and by mobilizing our networks, then we can see true continued movement in the work to end trafficking.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
Thank you so
awesome.
much for the opportunity. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming. Really, thank you. Well, that's all for today's episode. Stay tuned for what we have coming up next. And thanks so much for watching.